Hello again, welcome back to another episode of Manx Radio's newscast, where we'll dive into a topic in more depth than you'll perhaps hear on The Breakfast Show, Man in Line Update or the hourly bulletins. Now, the Isle of Man's Public Services Commission has put forward a new pay offer for the next 3 financial years. Public and civil servants would expect to be taking home a cumulative 2% increase this fiscal year, rising by the same percentage for the 2 years thereafter. Although inflation is at a 3-year low, the pay offer is below inflation, which Trade Union Prospect isn't best pleased with. I sat down with Mick Hewer, the union's negotiations officer.
Our initial feedback on that is that that's going to be unacceptable.
Okay, what figure are you hoping to get for, let's say, the 24 to 25 pay period?
When we put in our initial claim based on the information that we had at that time, so it was at the end of last year, we were looking in the region of 8%. And there was a reason for that. One, because that is what the RPI figures were running around. And also we wanted a long-term restorative pay increase. Our members have suffered year after year with below inflation pay rises. But I'll preempt your next question, but I do accept that we've now moved on from that period and that inflation does seem to be falling, whether you use CPI or RPI. But the fact remains that 2% that's been offered to our members, I don't think is acceptable, and I'm pretty sure that our members won't find that acceptable either. We accept that because the employer has dragged the feet yet again, to their benefit, and I'll explain why I think it's to their benefit in a minute. But yeah, 2% does not come anywhere near the mark.
Okay, well, you mentioned to the employer's benefit. How is that going to benefit them?
Well, they've already said that leavers won't be paid. Now, traditionally, up until last year, if the unions and the employers didn't reach agreement until after the anniversary date, so in this case, the 1st of April, then people that were employed on that date or who had subsequently left their employment up to the date that agreement was reached would receive back pay, which is quite correct. They should receive back pay. They've worked the hours. It's not their fault that the employer hasn't come to the table and reached agreement with the unions in an effective time period. If we'd settled in March, we wouldn't have this issue. So the benefit to the employer by delaying talks and by delaying settlement is they're saving money because they're not paying people that leave their employment between the 1st of April and the date that agreement is reached with the unions.
So why do you think that government workers and civil servants deserve more than a 2% increase?
I don't think it's just the government workers, to be honest with you. I think everybody deserves an inflationary pay rise year on year. But if you want a specific answer and you look at what government workers actually undertake and the number of hours that they're working, because let's not forget that contractually, most government workers are contracted to work 37 hours. There's an awful lot, particularly in the Public Service Commission, that work well above 37 hours and are told that they need to do so for time off in lieu at flat rate, and assuming that they can actually get the time off when they want to take it back. So the work anything above 37 hours, there's a lot of our members who are working for nothing.
When you say working for nothing, you mean at their standard pay rate?
Well, they don't even get that. So they'll ask you to work additional hours. You work the additional hours and they'll say, well, we'll give you next Thursday off instead. So it suits us to change your hours around. It suits us for you to work 40 hours this week, 42 hours, 43 hours, and we'll give you the extra 4 or 5 hours off to suit us at some point in the future. Rather than I'll work the extra hours and my contract says that I'm entitled to paid overtime. And you can't get the overtime because they're being manipulated into we can't afford it. That's all we hear nowadays. We can't afford it, we can't afford it, we can't afford it. But if they can't afford it, somebody needs to start saying why they can't afford it. And somebody needs to start saying how the public services are going to suffer.
Well,
because
some people might say they can't afford it because the unions consistently ask for higher pay increases each year. What would you say to that?
We ask for, year on year, an inflation-proof pay award so that people's standards of living increase. year on year moving forward. For decades, we failed in that on the whole. It's very rare, if you look back on the figures, that we have managed to achieve an above inflation pay award. So year on year, our members' standard of living is dropping. The amount of work that they're producing and the type of work that they're expected to undertake is increasing year on year. Pay doesn't match what our members are expected to provide on a daily basis.
What would you say to people who think that civil servants get an easy ride in comparison to the private sector? Because if KPIs aren't met in the private sector, you do risk losing your job, but that doesn't appear to be the same for government workers, does it?
It does seem to be the same. I'm dealing with a number of people that are a threat of redundancy potentially at the moment, and last year and the year before. So the threat is always there in the private sector and in the public sector. The fact remains that if you're doing a job, you deserve to be paid a fair rate of pay for what you produce. And I don't hear anybody ringing up on your mandate line, coming onto your radio station and saying where they expect the cuts to be made. Very often hear people ring up and say, we need to cut the civil service, we need to cut jobs, it's top heavy, but nobody says where those cuts should take place. So I disagree with anybody that will say to me that our members don't deserve a fair pay award year on year. And as a minimum, they should be paid the inflation figure at the time. And we start talks in October, November, December, January.
So do you dispute? So do you dispute that there are too many civil servants?
Oh yeah, categorically deny that there's too many civil servants. I'd like somebody to tell us where there are too many civil servants.
Do you know
specifically what they need to do when they come on to complain that there are too many civil servants is to say in what departments and what specific jobs they think the civil service should cut.
Do you know what percentage of the working population are civil servants or public sector?
I don't.
Okay.
To be honest, I can find out, but no.
Well, I mean, it's 18.7%, so almost 20% of the working population. But we'll move on. We've spoken about inflation. Inflation is at a 3-year low. We've seen a tax rise, which is said to be ring-fenced for the health service and hopefully will generate an additional £20 million extra. Do you think that the public will take kindly to your demands, that you're asking for more? Or do you think they'll say it's unreasonable, especially in a time when many are suffering pay cuts by way of global economic issues and obviously closer to home, the 2% tax increase?
Well, that's it. Well, you've just hit the nail on your head, haven't you? You've just said that many people are suffering pay cuts. Well, our members are suffering pay cuts as well. It's not my job. I don't work in Treasury. I'm not the Treasury Minister. Treasury need to balance their books and they need to manage on a daily basis income and expenditure, and they need to plan ahead. What they don't need to do is continually cut the take-home pay of the working classes, the people that go to work and provide the services that Isle of Man government continually say they need to deliver. And incidentally, the services that the public expect. You can't have a system where people are expected to improve on what they deliver day in, day out, that they go to work day in, day out, and then at the end of the week, they're told, we're going to pay you less in real terms today than we did yesterday. And that's exactly what this pay award does.
Okay, so what next? If you go to the Public Services Commission and say, no, we're not accepting this 2% offer, and they say, well, that's all that is on offer, take it or leave it, what happens next?
We would then carry out a consultative ballot of members to ask them what type of action, if any, they'd be prepared to take in furtherance of a better award. And once we'd have that information, we would request some additional talks with the PSC.
So this could
at the moment, I'm hoping that there will be another round of talks and that the employer will come to the senses and realise that 2% this year, 2% next year, and 2% the year after simply isn't going to wash it. In fact, I'm disappointed that they've that they've offered a 3-year deal with such low figures and limited protection.
It is only a 2-year deal realistically, because they do say that the third year has a caveat depending on what March 2026's inflation figure is. So that still is up for debate depending on what inflation does. So it is only realistically a 2-year deal with that caveat at the end of it, isn't it?
Yeah, caveat in 2026. Yeah. So I suspect that once we've had further discussions with our membership, we'll be looking for a single 1-year deal. Once we've concluded that as quickly as possible, then I would expect to open talks for 25, 26 into 27, so that we're not messing around in June, July, probably August, still trying to settle this year and years to come.
Okay, and you've mentioned that industrial action could be on the cards depending on how the talks play out. Assuming that strikes end up going ahead, would those be paid strikes or are those unpaid?
All strikes are unpaid. The employer doesn't pay people when they're not working. I would hope that we never come to that position. I wouldn't ever. I would see that as a failure on my part if any of our members have to resort to taking industrial action. And I would see it as a failure on behalf of the employer as well.
What would you say to the public whose money it is that obviously pays civil servants that might feel uncomfortable, but they're paying for these public services, but during any industrial action may not be having them fulfilled to the extent that they expect?
Well, obviously, we would apologise if there's any point at which we take industrial action. But at the end of the day, if that's the last resort, and it is a last resort, then that potentially is what will happen. But we're miles off that yet. That wouldn't happen overnight. But you are right. It is a possibility. It may be a distant possibility at this moment in time. But the fact remains that anybody that's a member of a trade union has the legal right, subject to certain regulations that they've got to meet and requirements, can take lawful industrial action. Now, I'm hoping that we won't come to that. I'll be very surprised if we come to that, because generally we can continue negotiations and we do settle. But you have to have in the back of your mind, people thought that with the nurses, and they were pushed and pushed and pushed, and eventually they took industrial action, because there was nothing else. There wasn't anything else left for them to do.
Thank you for making it to the end of the Manx Radio newscast. You are obviously someone with exquisite taste. May I politely suggest you might want to subscribe to this and a wide range of Manx Radio podcasts at your favourite podcast provider, so our best bits will magically appear on your smartphone. Thank you.